Before there was sand, the elders said, there was a forest. Not a desert with a few trees clinging to a wash. A forest. Tall, green, water everywhere, a world so full of growing things that a person could walk for days and never leave the shade. And then something happened to it. Something the written histories of this continent do not record, do not explain, and in most cases do not even acknowledge. The people who remembered it were not writing books. They were telling a story, passing it hand to hand, mouth to ear, generation to generation, in a language that a U.S. Army surgeon in the 1880s spent years of his life trying to learn. His name was Washington Matthews, and what the Navajo told him out on the high desert of New Mexico in the years before the 20th century began is one of the strangest and most overlooked records we have. Because if you read it the way the elders meant it, I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. And not the way a museum catalogue files it away. You find something buried inside it. A memory of a green world. A memory of that world ending. And a memory of what came after the water left and the sand arrived. Today we are going to walk through that record. Who Matthews was, how he earned the trust to hear these stories in the first place, and what exactly the Diné described to him about the worlds that came before this one. And then we are going to ask the question that the official version of history would rather you never ask. What if the story is not a myth in the way we use that word? What if it is a memory, worn smooth by time, of a landscape that really was green, really did drown, and really was buried under the sand that now defines the place? Let's go back to the beginning. In the middle of the 19th century, the American Southwest was, to the eyes of the men writing the reports, an empty place. That word gets used again and again in the documents of the era. Empty, barren, waste. The maps left great blank spaces. The surveyors described a country of rock and thirst, fit for almost nothing, valuable mostly for what might be dug out from underneath it. This was the land as the ledger saw it. And the ledger, then as now, decided what counted as real. But the land was not empty. It was full of people who had been there for a very long time and who carried in their heads a library that no surveyor thought to open. The Diné, whom the Spanish and then the Americans called the Navajo, lived across a vast stretch of what is now Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado. They herded sheep, they wove, they farmed the washes where water still ran, and they held, in their ceremonies and their long winter tellings, an account of where the world came from that had nothing to do with the story printed in the newcomers' books. Into this collision of ledgers walked Washington Matthews. He was not a conqueror, and he was not a missionary. He was a physician. Born in Ireland in 1843, raised in the United States, trained in medicine, and commissioned into the army as a surgeon. The army sent him west, as it sent many men west, to patch up soldiers and manage the small, brutal illnesses of frontier posts. He ended up, in the years around 1880, stationed at Fort Wingate, near Gallup, in the heart of Diné country. And there something happened to him that did not happen to most of the men who passed through those posts. He got curious, and then the curiosity turned into something closer to obsession. Matthews began to learn the language, not a handful of trade words. The actual language, in its depth, with its layers of ceremony and its precise, careful grammar. This was not a small thing. Navajo is a famously difficult language for an outside speaker, so difficult that the United States would later build an unbreakable military code out of it. Matthews sat with speakers, wrote down sounds, checked and rechecked, and slowly, over years, became one of the very few outsiders who could follow not just a conversation but a ceremony. He could hear a chant and understand what was being said inside it. And because he could understand, the elders began to let him listen. This is the part that gets lost when we file Matthews away as just another government ethnographer. The stories he recorded were not extracted, they were given. Given by singers and elders who decided, for their own reasons, that this strange, respectful, fluent army doctor was someone they could trust with things that mattered. Some of what he was shown was sacred in the deepest sense, the kind of knowledge that was normally spoken only at the right time of year, in the right way, by the right person. That he was allowed to hear it at all tells you something about the relationship he built. It was not perfect. He was still an agent of a government that was, in the same years, doing terrible things to these same people. But within that impossible situation, a real trust grew, and through that trust came the record. How hard was the language he set himself to learn? Hard enough that, decades after Matthews was dead, the United States military would take that same Navajo language and build a battlefield code out of it that no enemy in the Second World War ever cracked. Whole campaigns turned on messages spoken in Diné because the language was so intricate, so tonal, so utterly unlike anything an outsider could pick up in a hurry, that it functioned as an unbreakable cipher on its own. That is the language Matthews sat down in front of in the early 1880s and decided to master, not to weaponize it, to listen with it. He worked at it the slow way, the only way there is. He found speakers who would sit with him. He wrote down sounds and had them corrected, then corrected again. He learned that a small shift in tone could turn one word into another with a completely different meaning, and that the ceremonies were built out of exactly those shifts, layered and deliberate, a poetry of precision. Over years, not months, he crossed the line from a man who could ask for directions to a man who could sit through a night-long ceremony and follow the meaning of the songs as they were sung, and that changed everything about what he was allowed to hear. There is a kind of knowledge that does not get handed to a stranger who needs a translator standing between him and the words. It gets handed, if it gets handed at all, to someone who can receive it directly in the language it was meant to live in. By learning to be that person, Matthews made himself into a vessel the elders could actually use, not a tourist collecting curiosities for a cabinet back east. Someone who could carry the words themselves, intact, in the form they were supposed to take. We should not romanticize that into something it was not. He was still an outsider, still an officer, still writing for an audience of scientists who thought of all this as data. But the fluency was real, and the trust it earned was real, and without both there would be no record at all. Matthews published what he learned. His major works came out in the 1880s and 1890s, and then in 1897 the fullest version, a volume he called Navaho Legends. He also documented the great ceremonies, the mountain chant and later the night chant, in enormous detail. He wrote down the songs, he described the ritual, and he reproduced, as carefully as anyone ever had, the extraordinary paintings made of sand. Take the night chant, the ceremony Matthews devoted one of his greatest works to. It is a healing ceremony, held across 9 nights in the cold season, a marathon of song and ritual and dry painting aimed at restoring a person to balance, to health, to right relationship with the world around them. Over those 9 nights the holy people are called. The masked figures appear. The great designs are laid out in sand, used and swept away. Hundreds of songs, in a fixed order, not one of them optional, are carried through the dark. Matthews sat through this, understood it, and wrote it down with a thoroughness that still astonishes the people who study it now. He grasped that he was not watching superstition. He was watching a cathedral raised and unbuilt inside a single week, out of sound and sand, from memory, by people who had kept the plans in their heads for uncountable generations. And running underneath the healing is the story, the retelling of how things came to be, of the worlds below and the climb upward, of the ordering of this world after the last one drowned. The ceremony does not only treat a sick body, it re-anchors that body inside the whole history of the cosmos, all the way back through the vanished worlds. To be healed, in this understanding, is to be placed correctly within a story that begins before this world existed. The green world that was lost is not a footnote to the tradition, it is load-bearing. It is part of what every ceremony reaches back to touch. That is why the loss of these stories was never a small cultural matter, a few quaint tales slipping quietly away. To break the story was to break the medicine. To make a child forget the worlds below was to cut that child off from the very framework in which healing and balance and belonging were even defined. The people who set out to erase the memory may not have grasped the full weight of what they were reaching for, But the elders who resisted them understood it exactly. They were not protecting folklore. They were protecting the architecture of an entire world, the map that told you where you stood and how far back the standing went. And a little of that architecture, against every odd, survived on paper, because one army surgeon learned to hear it and could not bring himself to let it vanish unrecorded. We will come back to the sand, hold on to it, because the sand is where this whole story turns. But first, the beginning of everything, the story the elders told Matthews about how the world came to be. Because before you can understand a forest that vanished, you have to understand what the Diné said came before this world at all. The account Matthews recorded is not a single flat creation in the way a casual reader might expect. It is not one world made in 7 days and left to run. It is a story of worlds, plural, a sequence of them, stacked beneath the one we stand on now, each one inhabited, each one left behind. In the tellings Matthews wrote down, the first beings did not begin here. They began below, in a world underneath this one. And when that world became unlivable, they climbed, up, out of the world that had failed, into the next one. And when that one failed in its turn, they climbed again. Think about what that structure is actually saying. It is saying that the present world is not the first. It is saying that there were earlier worlds, real places with real ground and real sky, where the people lived, and that those worlds were lost, ended, left below. The emergence, as the story is often called, is the long journey upward through a series of vanished worlds toward the one we occupy now. And the reasons those earlier worlds ended are worth sitting with, because they are not vague. In the accounts, the earlier worlds do not simply fade, they are destroyed. There is discord. There is flooding. In more than one telling, water rises, water that will not stop, water that swallows a world and forces everyone living in it to flee upward or drown. The people escape by climbing, sometimes through a reed that grows tall enough to reach the ceiling of the sky, and they emerge into the next world, just ahead of the flood that is consuming the last one. Let me slow down and walk through the worlds themselves, because the detail is the whole point, and because these are sacred tellings that deserve to be handled with care rather than rushed. Versions differ from singer to singer and from family to family, and no short retelling by an outsider can do justice to something that takes a night or more to tell properly. What follows is only the shape of it, drawn from what Matthews and others wrote down, offered with respect for the people who hold the full and living version. In the tellings, the first world was small and dark. Some call it the Black World. It was inhabited not yet by people as we would know them, but by the first beings, insect-like, spirit-like, the beginnings of things. And that first world became a place of conflict, of behavior that could not be sustained, and so the beings had to leave it. They went up, through an opening, into the world above. The second world, in many tellings the Blue World, was wider, and there were more beings in it, and there was more to it. But it too filled with discord and could not hold. Again the ascent. Again the climb upward, out of a world that had turned against the ones living in it, into the next. The third world, often the Yellow World, is where the story deepens. Here appear the figures who carry so much of what follows. First man and first woman, formed and named. Coyote, who is never simply good or simply bad, but is always the one who cannot leave things alone. There were rivers in this world, and mountains in this world. There was a real geography, a real fullness. It was, in the tellings, a world you could live in and love. And it is this world, the full one, the one with rivers, that ends in water. The flood in the third world is not random weather. In the tellings, it is caused. There is a being of the deep waters, a great water creature, and Coyote, being Coyote, takes something from that being that he should never have taken. Its children, in many versions, and the water rises to take them back. It rises, and it rises, and it will not stop, and the beautiful full world begins to drown, and every living thing in it has to flee upward or die. They climb. In the heart of the story, a great reed grows, tall enough to reach the sky of that world, and the people and the beings climb up inside it, racing the water, as the world they knew vanishes beneath them. They emerge, through a hole in the sky, into the world above. This world, the one of sand. Read that again and hold it against the land. A full world, with rivers and mountains that a people loved and lived in. A rising water that could not be stopped. A desperate climb up and out, just ahead of the drowning. And then arrival into a new, harder world, where the survivors have to begin again and build the shape of things we would recognize. The mountains get set in their places. The sun and moon are put in the sky. Order is made out of the aftermath. There is a detail worth sitting with here. The story does not present this world, our world, as the goal. It is not the promised land at the top of the climb. It is the place you ended up because the last place drowned. It is the aftermath world. And everything sacred that the Diné do in it, every ceremony, every painting, is in some sense about keeping this aftermath world in balance so that it does not go the way of the ones below. That is a very particular way to understand where you live. Not as the triumphant peak of a climb upward, but as the survivors' camp pitched carefully after a fuller world was lost. A world of abundance, then water, then a climb, and a new world, harsher than the one before. That is the shape of the story. And if that shape does not make the hair on your arm stand up a little, read it again, because you have heard that shape before from cultures on the other side of the planet who never met the Diné and never could have. Now, the standard way to handle this is to smile gently and file it under mythology. A nice story. A metaphor for the human condition, perhaps, or a way of encoding moral lessons about greed and disharmony. And there is real truth in reading it that way. These are sacred stories, and the people who hold them understand them as far more than a documentary of geology. To flatten them into a mere record of ancient weather would be its own kind of disrespect. The elders were not filing a survey report, but here is where we slow down, because there is a difference between a story that was invented to explain the world and a story that was remembered because it happened. And the thing about a real memory, passed down long enough, is that it starts to sound like a myth. The details get polished. The names change. The reed that saved the people might once have been a boat, or a mountain, or a high place where the water could not reach. 10,000 years of retelling will do that to anything. The question is not whether the story is literally a transcript. Of course it is not. The question is whether, underneath the polish, there is a real event, a real world that was green and then was not. And this is where we have to leave the fireside for a moment and look at the ground itself. Because the land the Diné were describing this in, the land Matthews was standing on when he wrote it down, has a secret of its own. And modern science does not dispute this part at all. The American Southwest was not always desert. That is not speculation. That is geology, and it is not controversial. If you go to the painted desert of Arizona, to a place now called the Petrified Forest, you can walk among the fallen trunks of an ancient forest so old it has turned entirely to stone. Trees the size of the great conifers, lying in the sand, transformed molecule by molecule into rock, in colors of red and violet and gold. A forest, in the desert, turned to stone and half swallowed by sand. The mainstream date on that particular forest is Taft, deep, deep in the geologic past, long before any human being walked there. But the physical fact remains, printed into the land in a way no one can argue with. This place, this dry, cracked emptiness, was once green enough to grow a forest. And the forest is still there, if you know that stone was once wood. That is the deep past, but the recent past tells a version of the same story, and this is the version that matters for us. Because within the span of human habitation, within the tens of thousands of years that people have lived in North America, the Southwest was dramatically wetter than it is today. There were great lakes across the Great Basin that are now bone-dry flats of cracked white mineral. There were marshes and rivers where there is now only wind. As the last ice age ended, an enormous climate shift dried the region out, and it dried out while people were there to watch it happen. Human beings stood on the shores of lakes that no longer exist. Human beings hunted animals in grasslands that are now dunes. Sit with that. There were people in this land when it was green, and those same people's descendants were still in this land when it became sand. The transformation was not instant. It happened over generations, over centuries, slow enough to live through and fast enough to notice. A grandmother could have told her grandchildren about a spring that used to run where there was now only dust. That grandchild could have told her own grandchildren. And so on, and so on. down the long chain of memory, until the specifics wore away, and what remained was the shape of the thing. There was a green world. The water came, or the water left, and the green world ended. We climbed up into this harder world, the world of sand, and here we are. And now hold that against what the earth sciences have reconstructed about this exact region, not in the unimaginable deep past, but within the span of human memory. When the last ice age was ending, the southwest and the Great Basin beside it were a different world, where there are now dry playas, flat white expanses of cracked mineral that shimmer in the heat. There were lakes, enormous ones. Across the basins to the west lay inland seas that geologists have named Lake Bonneville, Lake Lahontan, bodies of water so vast they would look like a mistake on a modern map of that bone-dry country. Closer to Dene land itself, in what is now New Mexico and Arizona, there were smaller pluvial lakes, marshes, wet valleys, grasslands thick with game. The land was cooler, wetter, greener. Great animals moved across it, the megafauna of the Ice Age, mammoths and camels and giant ground sloths. And there were people there to see all of it. Human beings had reached this continent and spread across it during exactly this wetter time. They hunted those great animals. They camped on the shores of those vanished lakes. Their stone tools still turn up in the dry sediment where the water used to be. This is not disputed. Human beings lived in the green southwest, and their descendants never left. Then it dried. As the Ice Age gave way to our present era, the climate shifted hard, and the region began the long transformation into the desert we know. The Great Lakes shrank and, in many cases, vanished entirely, leaving only white salt flats and the ghost of a shoreline etched high on a mountainside where the water once reached. The megafauna died out, whether from the changing climate, or from human hunting, or from both together. The grasslands gave way to scrub and sand. And all of this unfolded slowly enough that people lived through it, generation after generation, watching a wetter world become a drier one. It was not a single flood on a single afternoon, but it was a real ending of a real green world, witnessed by real human beings. If you want a more recent echo, one written plainly into the ruins, you do not even have to reach back to the Ice Age. Look at what happened to the ancestral Puebloans, the people who raised the great houses of Chaco Canyon and the cliff cities of Mesa Verde. For centuries they farmed and built and thrived across this landscape. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. In a stretch of time that was wetter and kinder than what came after. And then, in the 12th and 13th centuries, the rains failed. A series of brutal, prolonged droughts settled over the region, droughts that tree rings still record today in their tight, starved growth lines. The great houses were abandoned, whole settlements emptied. The people moved, scattered, regrouped elsewhere, carrying their memory with them. This is documented, dated, physical, a relatively green and settled world in this exact country, drying out and losing its people within the last 1,000 years. So when a tradition of this land says that there was a fuller world, and that it ended, and that the people had to move on into a harder one, it is not describing something without precedent here. It is describing something that has happened in this region more than once, on more than one timescale, in ways the science fully confirms. The specifics in the sacred story are their own thing, sacred and not to be flattened. But the underlying event, a green world that dried and drove its people onward, is not fantasy. It is close to the recurring biography of the American Southwest. Do you see what has happened? The geology and the story have started to say the same thing. Now I want to be careful here, more careful than the usual version of this kind of video tends to be. I am not telling you that the Dene emergence story is a coded geology textbook and nothing more. That would be its own arrogance. Taking a living sacred tradition and reducing it to a natural history documentary that happens to be wearing a costume. The people who hold these stories understand them as sacred, as instructions for how to live, as the framework of an entire way of being in the world. That is real and it deserves respect, and it is not in competition with anything I am about to say. But I am asking you to hold two things at once: that the story is sacred and meaningful in its own right, and that a sacred story can also carry, folded up inside it, the compressed memory of something that physically happened. Cultures do this. It is one of the oldest functions of story, to make a real event unforgettable by making it holy. You do not remember the flood because someone wrote it in a ledger. You remember it because it became the center of your understanding of the world, retold every winter for 10,000 years. The sacred is not the opposite of the true. Sometimes the sacred is how the true survives. And that brings us back to the sand. Because of everything Washington Matthews documented, nothing is stranger, when you look at it through this lens, than the paintings. The Diné make images of extraordinary complexity and beauty as part of their healing ceremonies. Matthews described them at length, reproduced them in color plates, and understood, better than most outsiders ever have, what they were for. And what they are made of is the thing that stops you cold once you have been thinking about a buried green world. They are made of sand, ground pigment, colored sands, crushed minerals, pollen, cornmeal, charcoal, poured by hand with astonishing precision onto the floor, without brushes, without a net or a grid, from memory, following patterns that must be reproduced exactly or the ceremony does not hold. Figures of the holy people, the sacred plants, the four mountains, the structure of the cosmos itself, laid out in colored sand on the ground of a dwelling in the desert. And then, when the ceremony is complete, the painting is destroyed, swept up, erased the same day it was made. The whole point is that it does not last. It is created with unbelievable care and effort. It does its work, and then it is unmade and returned to the earth. Now, a people who carry a memory, however folded and sacred, of a green world that was buried under sand. And their most sacred images, the very structure of creation, they draw in sand, and then they let the sand take it back. I am not going to tell you what to feel about that. I am only going to point at it and let it sit there. A cosmos drawn in the exact medium that, in the story, swallowed the world that came before. Made, and then buried, on purpose, again and again, as an act of devotion. Consider what one of these paintings actually demands. A ceremonial singer must hold in memory, with no reference laid out in front of him, the exact arrangement of a design that may contain dozens of precisely placed figures, each in its correct color, its correct posture, its correct relationship to all the others. There is no sketch to copy. There is no grid drawn on the ground. The knowledge lives entirely in the mind of the person who carries the ceremony, learned across years of apprenticeship, and it must be reproduced correctly, because an error is not a matter of taste. A misplaced figure can undo the entire ceremony. The stakes of accuracy are total, and the medium is loose-colored sand, trickled between the fingers onto the floor. Think about the control that takes a line of pigment laid down freehand, by hand, thin and true, in a substance that wants to scatter with every breath of air. Matthews watched this done and understood that he was seeing a discipline as demanding as any art the wider world would ever hang in a gallery. The difference is that the gallery keeps its paintings and calls the keeping respect. Here, respect meant the opposite. Because when the ceremony has done its work, the painting is unmade. The figures are disturbed in a set order, the sand is gathered up, and it is carried out and returned to the earth. What took hours of concentration and years of learning to create is gone by nightfall. It was never meant to last. Its power is bound up in its impermanence, in the fact that it is made, used, and given back. The Diné understand this as part of what makes it work, and it is not a loss to them in the way it would feel to an outsider. It is the design functioning exactly as it should. But sit with the image one more time, through the lens we have been building. A people carrying, however folded and sacred, the memory of a world that was buried under sand, pouring the entire structure of creation out of colored sand onto the ground, and then, deliberately, with ceremony, burying it, returning it to the sand, making and burying the cosmos, by hand, over and over, as the most sacred thing they do. Whatever else that is, it is a people who have made an intimate peace with the act of a world being covered over and given back to the earth. They do not flee from that act. They rehearse it, they live inside it. Matthews saw the beauty of it. He wrote about the skill, the memory, the ritual precision. I do not know that he ever stood over one of those paintings and thought about the forest that turned to stone a few days' ride away, or the lakes that had become salt flats, or the story of the drowned worlds beneath this one, and put it all together. That is the connection we are making now, looking back with more than a century of hindsight and a fuller picture of the land's history than he had. But he preserved the pieces. Without Matthews, and the handful of others like him, and above all without the elders who chose to speak, we would not even have the pieces to connect. And that, right there, is the part of this story that should make you angry if you let it. Because think about how close all of this came to being lost completely. Think about how much of it was lost. The record we have is a thin thing. It survives because one unusually devoted man learned an impossibly difficult language, and because a few keepers of knowledge decided, against every reason not to, that it was worth telling him. Everything about the era was working to erase exactly this kind of memory. Children were being taken from these same communities and sent to boarding schools whose stated purpose was to strip the language and the stories out of them. The ceremonies were discouraged, sometimes outlawed. The whole machinery of the period was aimed, explicitly, at replacing the old memory with a new story, the story printed in the newcomers' books, the story that said this land was empty until it was discovered. And here is the economic heart of it, the part that turns this from a nice piece of folklore into something with teeth. That word, empty, was not innocent. Calling a land empty is not a description, it is a claim. An empty land belongs to no one, which means it can belong to whoever files the paperwork. An empty land has no prior history, which means the history that matters begins with your arrival. An empty wilderness, untouched, waiting, is a story that does an enormous amount of work. It justifies, it clears the ledger, it turns a taking into a founding. But a land that was green, and was full, and was remembered, all the way back through drowned worlds and buried forests, by people who were standing right there the whole time, is a different kind of land entirely. That land is not empty. It has been occupied by memory for longer than the occupiers can imagine. And that memory is inconvenient, because it says the wilderness was never empty, and the history did not begin with the survey. So the memory has to go, not by argument, by replacement. You do not debate the old story. You simply make sure the children never learn it, and you wait one generation, and it is gone. And it is worth being precise about the machinery, because vague talk of forgetting lets the specifics off the hook. There were mechanisms, named and legal and profitable. There was the idea, old in European law by the time it reached this continent, that land not being used in a recognized way was, for legal purposes, nobody's, a wilderness, available. The Diné had lived on and shaped their country for centuries, but they did not fence it and file deeds on it in the manner the newcomers recognized, and so the newcomers' law could treat it as blank. That legal fiction was not an accident of paperwork. It was the door through which a continent changed hands. There was the survey, which turned living land into a grid of numbered squares that could be granted, sold, traded, and taxed. There were the railroads, handed enormous strips of that land by the government as payment for laying track, land that had to be understood as empty and available in order to be given away at all. There was the wave of settlement invited onto ground that was, in the official telling, simply waiting for it. Every one of these depended on the same premise, that the land had no prior owners with a prior claim, because it had no prior history that counted. Empty land, waiting land, the story and the ledger reinforcing each other perfectly, each one making the other true. And there were the schools. This is the hardest part to say, and the most important. In the same decades that Matthews was carefully writing down the old stories, the government and the institutions around it were funding places whose explicit, stated purpose was to make sure the next generation of native children would not carry those stories forward. Children were taken, sometimes far from home, forbidden their language, punished for speaking it, cut off from the ceremonies, and drilled instead in the newcomer's history, the one that ran upward from an empty beginning. The slogan attached to the movement, from one of its own founders, spoke of killing what the child was in order to save the person who remained. Read that plainly. The forgetting was not a side effect. It was the design. Someone understood, correctly, that a people who remembered a fuller world and a prior claim were an obstacle, and that the cleanest way past the obstacle was a classroom. So, when we ask why the official history of this land runs upward from emptiness and files the old memory under myth, we do not have to guess at motives. The motive is written into the land grants and the railroad charters and the school ledgers. Emptiness was worth money. Forgetting was worth money. And the story that made both possible was worth more than either of them alone. That is how a world gets forgotten. Not with a cataclysm, or not only with a cataclysm, with a curriculum, with a map that leaves the blank spaces blank, with a ledger that only counts what it wants to own. The forest before the sand did not just get buried by weather 10,000 years ago. The memory of it got buried again, much more recently, and much more deliberately, by a story about empty land that was worth a great deal of money to the people telling it. And this is the pattern, once you learn to see it, that shows up over and over across the whole history of how we were taught the past. A story of progress. A story that runs in one direction, from primitive to advanced, from empty to settled, from darkness to the bright present, with no golden age behind us, nothing lost, nothing that was ever grander than what we have now. It is a very convenient shape for history to have. It means nothing was taken because there was nothing there to take. It means the present is the peak, so there is nothing to mourn and no one to answer to. But the oral traditions do not run in that shape. They almost never do. Go looking across cultures that had no contact with one another, and you find the same stubborn insistence again and again. That there was a world before this one, that it was better, greener, more whole, that it ended in water or in fire or in a great forgetting, that we are the survivors, living in the aftermath, in a diminished world, carrying the memory of a fuller one. The Diné are not alone in this. They are one voice in a chorus that circles the entire planet, and the chorus is singing something that the official, progress-shaped history flatly denies. The chorus is singing that we came down from something, not just up from something. Look wider, and the pattern only sharpens. The Diné are one voice, but the chorus is enormous. Across the world, in cultures that had no way of speaking to one another, you find the same insistence. A world before this one, an age that was fuller or greener or more golden before something went wrong. A great flood, again and again, on nearly every inhabited continent, drowning the old world and leaving a remnant to begin again. The Mesopotamian flood older than the biblical one that echoes it. Flood stories scattered across the Pacific, across the Americas, across South Asia. Traditions of a lost first age from the Mediterranean to India to the peoples of the far north. The details never match, because these are not copies of one another, but the shape keeps returning. There was more, and it was lost, and we are the ones who came after. Now let me be fair to the other side of this, because the honest version of the story has to be. There is a strong, serious case for why these parallels prove less than they seem, and it deserves a real hearing rather than a straw man. The skeptic points out, correctly, that flood stories are almost predictable. Most human societies settle near water because water is life, and living near water means, sooner or later, catastrophic flooding. A flood large enough to end your world does not require a lost civilization behind it. It requires a river and a bad year. So flood traditions may recur across the planet simply because floods recur across the planet, with no shared memory of any single event required. The skeptic points out, too, that a golden age before a fall is exactly the story an aging teller in any culture would tend to reach for, because every generation half suspects the world was better when they were young, and that instinct, scaled up and handed down, can manufacture a lost golden age without any golden age ever having existed, and the skeptic warns, most sharply, about the danger of the very thing this telling is doing. The danger of taking someone else's sacred tradition, a living tradition that belongs to a specific people, and press-ganging it into a theory about the deep past that its own holders never made and might well reject. That is a real risk. It has been done clumsily and disrespectfully many times over, and it does harm. Those are good arguments. I am not going to pretend they are weak. If you walk away from this convinced that the Diné emergence tradition is a sacred framework for living and nothing more, a profound piece of cultural and spiritual architecture with no hidden geology folded inside it. You would be in respectable company, and no one could prove you wrong. But here is the reply, and then I will let you weigh it for yourself. Yes, floods recur near water, but not every one of these traditions is a simple flood. Many of them, the Diné, one among them, are specifically about a fuller world that ended and a passage down into a diminished one, which is a more particular claim than remembering a bad season on the river. Yes, the old always think the world was better when they were young. But that instinct does not explain why the memory so often attaches itself to a real, physical, confirmable change in the land, a green place that genuinely did dry, a coastline that genuinely did drown when the Ice Age seas came up. And yes, the appropriation risk is real, which is precisely why the version worth telling refuses to overclaim, refuses to put words in the elders' mouths, holds the sacred story as sacred, and only points, carefully, at the one place where the memory and the ground happen to agree. Pointing is allowed. Pointing, and then stepping back, and letting people decide what they are looking at. So which is it? A universal human habit dressed up to look like a memory, or a memory so old that it has come to look like a habit? I have told you where I lean. But the honest answer is that thoughtful people hold both, and the evidence, as it stands today, does not force the question shut. Which of them is right? I am not going to hand you a tidy answer, because anyone who hands you a tidy answer about the deep past is selling something. What I will tell you is that the confidence runs entirely in one direction. The written, official history is certain. It knows the land was empty. It knows the story runs upward. It knows the old memories are just myths. It is the oral traditions that are full of loss and warning and the ache of something gone. And in my experience, the version that admits it lost something is usually closer to the truth than the version that insists nothing was ever lost. Let's go back to Matthews, because the man himself is part of this story in a way that is almost too fitting. He kept working, kept recording, kept refining his understanding into the 1890s and beyond. His health began to fail him. He suffered a stroke, and then more decline, and the work of transcribing and translating became physically harder for him year by year. He was racing something, and he knew it. Not just his own body. He was racing the disappearance of the very knowledge he was writing down. Every singer who died with a ceremony only half recorded was a library burning. He understood that. There is a real poignancy in the image of this aging, ailing man, bent over his notes, trying to get one more chant down accurately before the person who carried it was gone, or before he himself was. And a great deal did get lost anyway. It has to be said plainly. What Matthews saved is precious precisely because it is a fragment. For every story he wrote down, there were others no outsider ever heard, that lived only in the community, and, where the community's continuity was broken by everything the era did to it, sometimes died there. We do not have the whole library. We have the shelf that one man could reach in the years he had, plus what the people themselves have carried forward on their own terms, which is the larger and more important thing by far. But the written scholarly record, the part that made it into the books the rest of the world can read, is thin. It is a keyhole, and through that keyhole we are trying to see a green world that ended before writing existed. Now here is a thing worth being honest about. Matthews was a man of his time, and his time had ideas we would find hard now. He was a better man than most of his colleagues in his respect for the people he studied, in his refusal to treat them as savages, in the genuine seriousness with which he took their intellectual and spiritual life. He argued, in an era that did not want to hear it, that these were sophisticated, complex, deeply thought-out traditions worthy of the same respect as any classical mythology. That was not a popular position. It cost him. But he was still an outsider looking in, still filing what he heard into the categories of his own science, still, in the end, an agent of the very system that was working to erase what he was saving. The record is real, and it is also filtered. We are hearing the elders through Matthews, through the assumptions of the 19th century, through the translation problems of an impossibly hard language. That is a lot of glass to see through. We should never pretend the picture is clean. But the shape survives the filtering. That is the remarkable thing. Through all those layers, the shape of the story holds. Worlds beneath this one, worlds that ended. A climb upward, fleeing water, into a harder place. and beneath it all, older than the specific tellings, the sense of a fuller world that came before the one of sand. So, let me ask you to do something. Before we finish, let me ask you to hold the whole thing in your mind at once, all the pieces, and just look at them together. A land that geology confirms was once green enough to grow forests, one of which stands petrified in the desert to this day. A recent climate history within the human era in which that same land dried from lakes and grasslands into the desert we know, slowly enough that people lived through the change and could have remembered it. A people who lived on that land continuously across that whole transformation. A sacred tradition held by those people that describes exactly this. A green world before this one. Its ending. A climb up into a harder world of sand, preserved through unimaginable pressure to forget. Recorded, barely in time, by one obsessive army doctor who learned the language well enough to be trusted with it, and expressed, most hauntingly of all, in sacred images drawn in coloured sand and then, deliberately, given back to the sand. I am not asking you to believe that the Dine were describing a lost technological empire or a single dated catastrophe you could pin on a calendar, or any of the tidy dramatic claims that this kind of story usually gets flattened into. I am asking something quieter, and I think harder. I am asking you to consider that the story might be a memory, that underneath the sacred structure, worn smooth by more time than we can properly imagine, there is a real green world, and a real ending, remembered by the only people who were there to remember it, and remembered in the only medium that could survive the loss of every written record, which is the human voice, telling the story again and again and again, until the story became holy, so that it could not be lost. And I am asking you to notice who benefited from calling that memory a myth, because the same story that says this land was empty, that history runs only upward, that nothing grand was ever lost, is the story that made the taking of the land into the founding of a country. The forest before the sand is not just a question about the deep past. It is a question about who gets to write the ledger and what they decide to leave off it. Washington Matthews died in 1905. He did not live to see most of what his work would come to mean, and he certainly never framed it the way we have framed it here. He was a scientist, recording what he could before it vanished. But by doing that, faithfully, in the years he had, he left a door open, a narrow one. Through it, more than 100 years later, we can still look back and see, dimly, the outline of what the elders were trying to hand down. A world that was green, water that rose, a climb into a world of sand, and a people who never once stopped telling the story, no matter how hard the age they lived in tried to make them forget. The desert keeps its own kind of record. The petrified trunks lie in the painted sand, wood turned to stone, a forest that will never rot and never quite disappear. The dry lake beds shine white where the water used to be. And in the ceremonies, when they are held, the cosmos is still poured out in coloured sand and then, with care, returned to the ground it came from, made and unmade, remembered and buried, over and over. They told Matthews there was a forest before the sand. The land agrees with them. And the only people who ever insisted otherwise were the ones holding the pen, drawing the map, and keeping the books they did not want anyone else to read. And if that is true, then the forest before the sand is not really a story about a lost world at all. It is a story about how memory outlasts the people who try to bury it. The lakes dried and the surveyors came and the schools did their work, and still the account climbed down the generations, hand to hand, mouth to ear, waiting for a listener. History is supposed to be whatever the record keepers wrote down, but every so often the thing they left out survives anyway, carried in a language they could not read, inside a ceremony they tried to end, in a painting made from the very sand that was meant to swallow it whole. The pen does not always win. Sometimes the memory is patient. Sometimes it simply waits for someone to learn the words. Maybe the elders were not describing a myth at all. Maybe they were doing what people have always done with the things too important to lose. They were remembering, and they were waiting for someone who could hear it, in the right language, to write a bit of it down before the sand closed over the rest.